Hello, everyone. We are Team 5, and I'm Boin Kang from CheongShim International Academy.
Hello, my name is Myeong Kang from St. Johnsbury Academy.
Hello, my name is Jenny Lee from Daewon for the Language High School.
I'm Gayoung Park from Guangzhou Korean School.
And I'm Haram from Chungnam Academy.
Before we start our presentation, we would like to send great appreciation to all the faculty members and fellow students who participated in challenging yet fruitful journey with us during the past 5 days. Our presentation will cover the introduction to the organization, UNODA, and its intervention in emergency situations. So this is our table of context. As part of Future Generation, we would like to introduce the aim of UNODA and SDG 16 along with real-life cases of UNODA's intervention. Finally, based on analysis on their past attempts to establish peace in international societies, we would like to suggest several solutions to support movements of this organization. This is the history of establishment of UNODA in chronological order. And as you can see, the name of this organization have been renamed multiple times until it is finally confirmed as United Nations Office for Disarmament Affair in 1998. Next, I'll go through the aims of UNODA. UNODA contributes to support development and implementation of practical disarmament measures after conflict, including disarming, destabilizing former authorities, and helping environment and refugees to reintegrate into civil society. This process of controlling disarmament, they support multilateral aims to build bonds and connection with social groups to fully provide humanitarian aid and military assistance. There are a total of 5 branches in UNODA, and one of them is Weapons of Mass Destruction branch. This particular committee controls nuclear weapons, which has been a primary concern as their destructive power poses a great threat to humanity. Now, I know that we already have learned about what weapons of mass destruction is in lectures we took during the past few days. So instead of me just speaking here, repeating what we already know about, I decided to do a quick quiz to check if you've paid attention to the lecture. So can anyone raise their hand and choose a correct list of WMDs between 1 and 2? Anyone just like turn on their microphone and call out the answers? Okay, seeing none, the answer is second one, because rifles are conventional weapons. Conventional arms branch takes part in preventing the uncontrolled proliferation and misuse of conventional weapons, which refer to any weapons that are not WMDs. The conventional arms include combat bikes, small weapons, and explosive arms. The regulation of such weapon is more challenging to those of WMD because of its widespread usage around the world. Due to continuous global digitalization, UNODA also participates in cybercrimes. And cybercrime is an evolving form of transnational crime. So our other members of our team will discuss this issue in depth later in our presentation.
SDG 16 is peace, justice, and a strong institution. It provides access to justice for all and creates effective and inclusive institutions at all levels and steps. Compassion and strong moral societies are essential to any democratic society. The goal is to promote a peaceful and inclusive society together. It is an impossible goal to achieve perfection, but at least each society has to be safe. So for example, there is a COVID-19, it is easy to infect other people, and in the worst case, it can be fatal to people's life. Coronavirus disease is an infectious disease caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And these viruses can infect people and some animals. SARS-CoV-2 was first known to infect people in 2019. The virus is thought to spread from person to person through droplets released when an infected person coughs, sneezes, or talks. Because it has a strong infectability, it may also be spread by touching a surface with the virus on it and then touching one's mouth, nose, or eyes. But this is less common, also called severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2. The World Health Organization is involved to make circumstances better to make a vaccine. There are a lot of targets and steps to achieve SDG 16. For instance, there is a SDG 16.1, such as significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. UN peacekeeping helps countries navigate the difficult path from conflict to peace. They have unique strengths, including legitimacy, burden sharing, and an ability to deploy police from around the world, integrating them with civilian peacekeepers to address a range of mandates set by the UN Security Council and General Assembly. For example, we can find UN peacekeepers in the military. And peacekeepers work alongside UN police and civilian colleagues to promote stability, security, and peace processes.
So, what are the effects of military attacks on human society? We will go deep about the effects in terms of environmental and humanitarian aspects. So, nuclear fallouts released by weapon detonations leads to structural destruction, death, and water supply contamination. The specific impacts that are researched were related to SDG 14, 15, and 16. So I will refer to these three goals with the environmental crisis caused by chemical and nuclear impacts. This is a picture of nuclear weapon fallouts. The contamination issue is a serious concept, and there is where goal 14 takes place, because the ashes that flow in the water will eventually poison any lives underwater. Do you think that this water contamination issue will stay as a damage to aquatic systems only? No, because people on land who accesses the contaminated water supply will be harmed as well, which intertwines with goal 15. These hazardous residues from nuclear testing and weapons are not only fatal, but also long-lasting. Here are some real-life examples that I found, so feel free to take a look at these examples. They're all cases where the residues were found over 40 years after their testings.
WMD stands for Weapons of Mass Destruction, has chemical, biological, and radioactive substances that can cause death and serious health problems. For example, anthrax is a disease that is weaponized and also a type of bacteria used in bioterrorism. And it can damage human-made structures such as buildings and also natural structures such as mountains. And there are effects of using WMD, and it can cause radiation poisoning in each environment. And radiation poisoning can reduce plant growth and pollute regional water supplies and affect agriculture. The first time that WMDs were used in warfare was in World War I. And in World War I was most damaging because of the landscape changes caused by trench warfare, and digging trenches caused trampling of grassland, badly affected plants and animals, and whisking of soil. And UNODA provides practical assistance in the disarmament of weapons of mass destruction that contain nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And UNODA supports and participates in non-diffusion of WMD with IAEA, OPCW, and CTBTO PrepCom.
Before I start, for more intuitive understanding, our team has invited a person who experienced all of the events that our team will talk about. Please welcome him, everybody. He told me to call him Mr. O, so from now on, I will call him Mr. O. Mr. O has been working at the United Nations for a very long time, and as I said before, he experienced Cuban Missile Crisis, 9/11 terror attacks, civil war in Syria, and cybercrime. Now, I'm going to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis based on Mr. O's experience. Let's go back to 1962. Mr. O cannot forget the Cuban Missile Crisis because there were too many events that made him shocked. There were various events until this incident, but the United States and the Soviet Union had the greatest impact. The United States and Soviet Union had an alliance that made Germany lose in World War II. After the world ended, the United States, Soviet Union, and England talked deeply about how to divide Germany. They divided Germany officially, but United States and Soviet Union both had their desire to reach their secret plan. Starting in Germany, they started to fight and the world was separated to two sides. To make matters worse, the double agent called Klaus Fox hid US atomic bomb precision design and gave to Soviet Union. From this point, Soviet Union started to make nuclear bomb. Mr. O was very scared because he thought World War III could happen. Mr. O knew that United States are making another level of nuclear bomb that had 1,000 times stronger power than before. He thought it was better to move to Cuba to escape from danger. Oh God, such an unlucky man, Mr. O. Soviet Union installed more than 100 nuclear bombs in Cuba, but the United States also knew this information. So Cuba, where Mr. O was staying, had a danger of being harmed. However, Soviet Union felt they are not able to win the United States, so they finished not shooting any nuclear bomb. After Mr. O experienced this adversity, he realized the importance of SDG 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. There are various targets that is presented in SDG 16, but Mr. O considered target 1, which emphasized reduce violence everywhere. He thought the reason why many people think SDG is so important these days is because adversity like Cuban Missile Crisis happened before, and no one knows that what will happen in future that threats our life. Based on SDG 16, Mr. O felt some necessity to focus on and think more about our attitude toward future.
For the next, I'm going to talk about a few cases of threatening world peace. For an adequate description of the situation, I'll bring Mr. O back again. In the early morning of Tuesday, September 11, 2001, Mr. O was walking on the street of the financial district of Lower Manhattan. As he worked in the UN, he was on his way to work. Because he stayed up late last night to complete his extra work at home, he was exhausted. But it was still a beautiful, typical day going to work. He was sipping his coffee and reading the daily newspaper. When it was about 8:40, suddenly the shrill sound of the jet engines was heard. What he saw was unbelievable. The tower of World Trade Center was collapsing, and a gigantic cloud of dust engulfed the whole street. The collision caused a massive explosion that showered burning debris over surrounding buildings and the streets below. Since he was pretty far from the explosion, he was relatively safe. About 20 minutes later, he heard the roar of engines again. When he heard about the second plane hit, he knew something wrong was going on. He could see people in horror and hear desperate screams from them. When he checked the news the next day, he knew that the terror of that day was from an Islamic extremist group supplied with weapons and developed its power through the illegal arms trade. Such terrorist groups are classified as non-state actors. And UNODA has adopted treaties such as the Arms Trade Treaty to prevent non-state actors from possessing illegal conventional weapons. ATT is an international treaty that regulates the international trade in conventional arms and seeks to prevent and eradicate illicit trade and diversion of conventional arms. Mr. O, working in UNODA for a long time, is interested in civil war and how it becomes a threat to world peace. While reading articles, he saw a photo of a father in Syria who lost his 2 babies from the early morning attack using chemical weapons. The civil war in Syria is an ongoing violent conflict between pro-democratic insurgents and the government of Bashar al-Assad started on March 15, 2011. He could see that children were the biggest victims of the civil war in Syria. Among the casualties of 400,000 in 10 years, 55 children had lost their lives since the civil war. During the 10 years of civil war, children's life expectancy was shortened by 13 years, and the mortality rate of Syrian children has increased by 50%. In civil war situations, children's fundamental right to be educated was ignored, and 2.1 million children could not receive a school education. Also, the long-lasting civil war had a severe impact on the physical and mental health of Syrian children. Many weapons in the country are threatening the lives of people living in Syria. He desperately felt the need for disarmament, especially in areas where the war was still on. He felt the need for SDG 16 to promote a peaceful and inclusive society together. It is an impossible goal to achieve perfection, but Mr. O strongly believes that its community has to be safe.
Now, let's look at the emerging issues. What do you think the emerging issues are these days? Anyone? Okay. It seems like no one has the answer. So, yes, it's cybercrime. Violence is no longer just referring to physical attacks. Along with the development of technologies, computers have become more important in commerce, entertainment, and government. On top of this, cybercrime, especially through the internet, has grown in importance. Cybercrime, also known as computer crime, is the use of computer as a tool to further illegal ends such as fraud, trafficking in intellectual property, stealing identities, or violating privacy. Cybercrime is committed every 39 seconds, and over 14 billion data records have been lost or stolen since 2013, and the number increases every day. Google has also detected a huge increase in phishing websites, which is a form of cybercrime, since the start of the pandemic due to the increase in the use of electronic devices. Now, let's call Mr. O again and here's experience. Mr. O, living his life, adapting to the change, was reading a newspaper about cybercrime. It was about North Korea using cyber attacks to gain its political goals and South Korea by stealing information and money, spreading a sense of vulnerability in Korean society. Other malicious actors have also disrupted information and communication technology systems in the ROK government and the private sector. The news article also talked about the South Korean nuclear and hydroelectric company, Korea Hydro and Nuclear Power, that was hacked at the end of 2014. Hackers stole and posted online plans and manuals for 2 nuclear reactors, as well as the data of 10,000 employees. Mr. O thought the internet had only its advantages, so the news was a really shock to him. A few years later, there was a digital Cold War between Washington and Moscow. The US stepped up digital incursions into Russia's electric power grid in warning to the President Putin, and a demonstration of how the administration is using authorities to deploy cyber tools more aggressively. The officials explained the previous unreported deployment of American computer code inside Russia's grid. Russia has inserted malware that was sabotage American power plants, oil and gas pipelines, or water supplies in future conflict with the US. Even though there was no evidence of this because the code has not been activated yet in both countries, the placement of malicious code inside both systems revived the question of whether a nation's power grid or other critical infrastructure constitutes a legitimate target for online attack. So after experiencing cybercrime right beside him, Mr. O became aware of the seriousness. He thought large scales of cybercrime can impact utilities, mass transportation systems, financial institutions, government operations, etc., leading to conflicts among people, private sectors, countries, and so on. Then Mr. O started to look at SDGs that are related to cybercrime. He found out that SDG goal number 16, especially target 1, was directly related to the issue. SDG 16.1 refers to significantly reducing all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. Even though cybercrime is not a form of physical violence, it is still a form of threat that is intentionally committed by criminals. So focusing on SDG 16.1, Mr. O thought there needs to be some actions taken. Mr. O looked for current existing solutions to cybercrimes, but found out that it was more of the user's responsibility to prevent the cyber attacks. For example, there were suggestions telling the users to keep software and systems fully up to date, to install a firewall, and to change passwords regularly. Currently, only 38% of global organizations claim they are prepared to handle a sophisticated cybercrime. Mr. O thought it was time for the UNODA to take action to prevent a new form of issue. So he thought the UNODA should help countries formalize all cyber-related issues, provide the basis for international cooperation, and work to increase trust between countries, industries, etc.
Oh, Mr. O wants to share some previous solutions. The first solution that Mr. O will share is CTBT. CTBT, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, was designed to prevent the development of new nuclear weapons and the improvement of the performance of existing nuclear weapons by banning all nuclear tests. Not only banning the nuclear tests that are happening on the ground, but also that are happening underground, underwater, even in the atmosphere. The treaty was ready for signature in September 1996 and has been signed by 185 nations and established by 170 nations. However, the treaty wasn't able to enter into force until it was approved by 44 specific nations, 8 of which are not ready for it. China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel, Iran, Egypt, and the United States.
The second solution that Mr. O believes that is significant is NPT. Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is a treaty adopted by the United Nations in July 1968 and officially enforced on March 5, 1970. Led by the United States and Russia, this treaty prohibits other nations developing nuclear weapons while admitting the exclusive possession of nuclear weapons by 5 countries, including China, United Kingdom, and France. However, the 5 member states cannot transfer nuclear weapons to other countries and must undergo nuclear inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The goal of NPT is to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons and to promote cooperation in the peaceful uses of nuclear and to achieve the goal of nuclear disarmament.
Last but not least, the third solution Mr. O found is the Arms Trade Treaty, or ATT. The Arms Trade Treaty is an international treaty that regulates the international trade in conventional arms and aims to prevent and eliminate illicit trade and diversion of conventional arms by establishing international standards governing arms transfers. The treaty entered into force on December 14, 2014, and at this point, the treaty has 110 states parties and 31 states that have signed but not yet ratified it. The treaty includes provisions for arms transfers, including export, import, transit, transshipment, and brokering. The treaty is the first international treaty to govern the legal trade of conventional weapons. Now let's go hear what Mr. O thinks about further solutions.
These are the available solutions. First, youth contribution to raise awareness. Second, increase the education for youth. Third, prevention and peaceful settlement of malicious activity in cyberspace. Lastly, put pressure on countries to join treaties in development or already ongoing. Thank you for listening to our presentation.
You so much on your work, Team 5. And any other questions? Yes, from Donghwan.
Hello, I'm Dongwani from Yongyul High School. I have 3 questions. First of all, I would like to ask the team's opinion on nuclear power, because the example they used of Chernobyl, I believe, is a very cherry-picked example, since it had no containment buildings, defective graphite-tipped fuel rods, and improperly enriched uranium fuel. And the test that actually did cause the disaster was a massive security breach, even by Soviet Union standards during the time. So I would like to ask the team's opinion on nuclear power.
Okay, first of all, thank you for your question and thank you for listening to our presentation. I wouldn't represent our whole team, so people might have different opinions, but I personally, the reason why we included biased or cherry-picked examples about nuclear power is because we want to emphasize how UNODA participates to like issues and problems that are caused by WMDs, which are nuclear plants or nuclear weapons. So apologies if that sounded biased, but we don't have negative impression on nuclear power, but we wanted to focus on the weapons only. So hope that answered your questions.
My second question is, a lot of countries that are reluctant to give up their nuclear arsenal are putting forward the argument that they can be as a deterrent. Like the reason why the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States never went hot was because they realized with these weapons of mass destruction, if a massive scale war did happen between the two of them, the entire planet will be annihilated. So that's a very large deterrent. And I believe that's one of the main factors. There hasn't been any major war since that period. So in brief, my question is, these countries say nuclear deterrence is a big thing that you need to consider if you are planning to get rid of nuclear weapons.
It is a really, it's hard to like represent or like speak as a participant of UNODA, obviously, because we're just like presenting about them. But what I understood was the aim of UNODA is not to like stop all the usage or like to take away any nuclear weapons from the countries who have already developed the nuclear weapons, but is to stop the spreadness of the hazardous weapon. So yes, there might be some pros of nuclear weapons or nuclear powers, as you've mentioned. However, considering the dangers and the threats to the humanities, UNODA aims to stop any more spreadness of the nuclear weapons.
Thank you. You've actually answered my third question as well, so that'll be all.
Thank you.
First, sorry for not turning on my camera because of my internet connection. I really enjoyed your presentation. And like in your presentation, you talked about how like cyber attacks are increasing. So like I was kind of just curious about your team's opinion about like, what do you think that future wars would look like? Do you think that like countries are going to use nuclear weapons or countries are going to like take more aggressive actions? Or do you think that countries are going to use like more new methods such as cyber attacks in the future?
Okay, so again, I'm not representing the whole organization or our whole team, but then what I think is because yes, there might be usage of nuclear weapons or like digital intervention. For instance, one of the lectures that we listened, he mentioned the usage of drones. So that could be one example of cyber attacks. So they might control or develop technology where drones or like electronic robots take place in the fight between nations. So I hope that could answer your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.